Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and welcome to our third annual Journalism Under Fire Conference. My name is Sandy Campbell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. Of course, like everything, we're all digital this year, and by now you know we have over 75 speakers and 18 days of conference, and I promise you it will be a fascinating journey. So, when I think about our last Journalism Under Fire Conference in 2019, I find the memories a little hard to access because quite a lot has happened since then. This bizarre year, this incredible year of 2020, has really been one of crisis, all kind of flowing together. Look at us now. We're all quarantined. We're all distanced. The virus is all around us. We have small businesses and jobs disappearing. We have a presidency challenged, and all, of course, against a backdrop of fire and storms in this relentlessly changing environment. And of course, because of all this, we have our own stories of crisis too, our personal ones. We're at home all the time. We don't fill the public spaces or squares anymore unless we take to protest. And our kids aren't with their friends. Because we don't know what's coming next, because we really have no idea. I think we need journalists now more than ever. They have the information, the smart people, the big picture. And also, well, as much of the big picture as we can realistically have in these difficult times. And what journalists give us is this currency, this vital currency that we use to stay informed, to think about things, to reflect on things, to vote, to stay connected with the wider world, to stay alive even. This is a momentous time. There is a lot going on right now. But right now, this is a dark reference point that the future us, I believe, will constantly look back upon and reflect upon. This time will forever be known as a lost year, as a year of crisis, as a year of pandemic. And just like you during this challenging time, I want my information from the very best, from the amazing thought leaders, from the incredible investigative journalists, from the biting political cartoonists. I want it all. I want to know what the New York Times and the Washington Post have to say about any of these crises. But so too, I want to know what the BBC News has to say. And I want to know what the Santa Fe New Mexican and Searchlight New Mexico have to say about this moment in time. Without these sources, I'm convinced I would be lost. And so how journalism itself responds to this crisis, to this moment in time, is absolutely key. And that's the major theme we'll explore in this conference. How major news outlets decide to cover crisis and how, and the ways in which they balance fact and opinion and bluster. These decisions have become, for all of us, definitional. And so we read and click and we watch so that we can understand how we got here. And even more importantly, we can understand how we're going to move forward. Even though Ben Smith of the New York Times tells us that journalists are not our friends, I sure like talking to them. They know their stuff. And alongside Ben, we're going to feature all kinds of different journalists over the coming 4 weeks. From our upcoming conversations with the irreverent but Pulitzer-winning political cartoonists Jack Oman and Matt Worker, to 60 Minutes Wes Lowry and Lauren Walsh and her photography on covering social crisis, to all the speakers returning to this stage from the past 2 years, including Malachy Brown from the New York Times, who just won Pulitzer Prize a few months ago, to Olga Yurkova, the founder of StopFake.org in the Ukraine, to Courtney Ratch, who is with the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a conference organizing partner to whom we're tremendously grateful for all their support. And we're also going to hear from people like Veronica Monk, who came to our first Journalism Under Fire, and she's going to tell us stories about being an editor in the extremely difficult context of Viktor Orban's Hungary. And then, of course, we have our stars from tonight. Nick Kristof from the New York Times and his Pulitzer-winning wife, Sheryl WuDunn. So before I introduce tonight's MC and one of my very favorite people, Dana Priest, let me offer a few quick welcomes. First, let me welcome the journalists from all around the world among us tonight through our remarkable 56-year partnership with the U.S. Department of State and its International Visitor Leadership Program. When I think of the hundreds of fascinating global folks who pass through Santa Fe every year from every corner of the world as part of this program, all I can say is we miss you. We miss you so much. And we know how much richer our world is with you. And especially at this conference where we've had journalists from all over come and add to the conversation. We really miss you, and we hope to see you back again soon. Tonight, let me also welcome students and journalists, professors and teachers, journalist students, of course, from across New Mexico, the country, from around the world. I hope you'll join us in learning as much as possible from the speakers we have lined up. We're depending upon you to sharpen your craft and learn, learn, learn. I should mention that today, November 10th, is Press Freedom Day here in Santa Fe. And as we do every year later in the program, we'll feature the mayor of Santa Fe, Alan Weber, who will offer us some remarks. We'll hear from a brilliant young student at New Mexico State University, which is down in Las Cruces, Xavier Dominguez. And of course, we'll listen to the music of New Mexico's very own Eliza Gilkyson singing about, really, what else in 2020? Fire. But first, let me introduce our biggest star from the past 2 years of Journalism Under Fire, Dana Priest. She, of course, is a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for the Washington Post and a Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the University of Maryland. Hi, Dana. Welcome.
Hi, Sandy. I'm so glad to be here. I have to say that when you started planning this, let's see, this is my 3rd year. And when you started planning this back in March or February, I was so excited to come back to Santa Fe because really, I don't know if you remember this, but I do, that how really coincidental, bizarre that it was that you and I were both we didn't know each other and we were both thinking about the same thing, which was how many journalists around the world had been killed and how that was escalating and what that meant, not just for journalism and the craft of being a journalist, but really for the world and for democracy. And you called me up and I thought, how strange, all the way from Santa Fe, which is a place I love and I come to because my couple friends are there. And so I'm so glad to be back. And I said I sure would come out to Santa Fe because I remember all the foreign journalists that would come out there. And the last time we were there, I just have to say that about 30 of us, including at least 25 from Africa, went to a tiny little bar after the last session and crammed it full and danced the night away. And I was certain that that would happen again. So I'm sure it will happen next year again.
Well, let's go down memory lane a little bit. Let's show a couple pictures of you at Journalism Under Fire. We'll just put this up here. This, of course, was from last year in 2019. There you are with Ivan Kolpakov, who we'll hear from again this year, the sort of editor-in-chief of Medusa.io. There you are in the audience. I'm actually sitting right beside you, but I decided to crop myself out of that. And here you are in our student chat room last year, speaking to all our students and just sort of sharing your wisdom. This is now from 2018, where you offered the opening keynote discussion. And the last but not least is one of my favorites. This is you here with former CIA operative Valerie Plame talking about all that dark underbelly spy stuff. Fascinating things. So
more spies in Santa Fe than I ever knew.
We do have a lot of them. Tell me something, Dana, about your experience at Journalism Under Fire that jumps out or that sticks with you over the years.
Well, I have to say that it's the students. I know the journalists that come are really amazing. And well, okay, I'm going to take two examples. One is I met a lot of journalists last year when I was very focused on the corrupting influence of social media, having done a film for with Frontline called Facebook, the Facebook Dilemma. And I met a woman from Mongolia. And as we were talking, she brought up the fact that they had a terrible problem with Facebook in Mongolia and that they tried to get it. It was a story like I'd been hearing from every part of the world about how fake news and false rumors were really inciting anti-democracy forces all over the world and even in Mongolia, and they could not get anybody from Facebook to listen. So that was one. The other thing that I love about the conference being in Santa Fe is all the students that you get. Students from Native American reservations who are student journalists, students from all around Santa Fe and from the other towns nearby. And I teach because I teach because I think it's important to pass on whatever you have to say to the next generation, but also because I really think that this generation of journalists that are in school these days are going to be the best generation yet, because they grew up with some of the technical skills that they're honing now in data journalism. And if we can just teach them how to talk to people and how to use people as sources, which they're a little bit shy about doing, because they don't even, they talk on the phone, or they don't even talk on the phone, they talk on text. But if we can do that, then they will be the best generation of journalists. And as the title of the conference suggests, and as your opening remarks suggest, we absolutely need the best, because the crises seem to be coming fast and furious.
So one of my favorite moments last year was going to dinner with you and Matt Rosenberg from the Times and a few others, and both of you giving an absolute sort of practice one masterclass on journalism ethics and objectivity, and you gave me a very hard time for my own politics, and I remember thinking, how could anybody really stay neutral in this
Mm.
crazed hyper partisan time, and yet understanding that journalists have an obligation to do so. How does any journalist stay objective and sort of laser beamed on the truth in this crazy moment we're in?
I really think that if you practice it enough, I'm like 35 years into this. Uh, it becomes natural, just like it's natural for doctors, to operate with dispassion. But that doesn't. And the real secret is what we get to put our opinion on are the topics we choose to cover. So when you get to be a certain age and you can actually do the sort of journalism you want to do, or cover the topics you want to cover, then you're not racing into news conferences with 3,000 other reporters. You're going off like Nick Kristof and Sheryl do, to go find the corners of the world that people aren't reporting on, or the stories that are underreported because people don't have lobbyists in Washington to tell those stories. And those are ultimately, the most rewarding and consequential often. One of the things that I want to have everybody think about this time around at this conference, is journalism, is be a little critical of journalism itself as part of the crisis, because just like social media is guided by their algorithms, which are guided by their profit motives, journalism has mimicked some of that. And so Donald Trump, as much as we criticize him for lying all the time, we also give him airspace all the time, in part because it drives viewers. And when he's no longer the president, I am a little concerned um, that the media will have a big either they'll have a big depression in their viewership, or they'll find another way to still give readers a very emotional but not very substantive news coverage. And so I am worried about our profession. I see that we've done that an awful lot in the last 4 years. Breathless kind of reporting, I put reporting in quotes, that does drive traffic because it's emotional. So we have a lot to talk about, and that hopefully that's going to be one of the things that we bring up.
Definitely. Well, let's talk about crisis for a moment. And I want, this is obviously the theme of this year's conference, but I wanted to ask you, I know you've covered crisis in some of your work in the past, and I thought it might be nice for us to hear an example of a crisis that you've worked on, and how you went about covering them, some of the challenges that you had in covering it.
Yeah, it's I mine would be 9/11, and it wouldn't be the day of, even though I did cover that. It would be the years after, and it felt like a years long crisis that didn't end until 10 years later. But in the first several years in particular, uh, I really feel like I felt like I was in a storm that I couldn't get out of, and I couldn't see my way. I couldn't see past my hand, really. And that is, and in that crisis, it was juggling between the voices inside the government that were saying we're going to be attacked. We see the lights blinking red. You remember the color coded chart, and not being able to figure out to what extent they were telling us the truth and how good their information was. So you could not apply any judgment. You had to cover that because that's all you really had until we got deeper into our own sources, and who our own sources who could give us a little bit more of a nuanced view of when the government said that, what it might really mean. And then of course it's switched, or eventually we found out the, the the downside of what the government was doing in response to 9/11, and that's what mainly I covered after a while, was the techniques that they were using overseas that the CIA in particular never had, which brought a lot of reaction towards a negative reaction towards the post to myself. And then I do remember thinking, we're never going to be out of this crisis. That the world has changed forever, and I kept holding on to the thought about Germany and Japan one at one point being our mortal enemies, and how close we are now to them. And I kept thinking to myself, it can't last forever. Nothing really lasts forever. And so that's really what some of what I want to explore when we talk about crises, is not just how we cover them day to day and with a lot of thought and trying to do deep reporting as the crisis washes over us, but also to somehow in the midst of it maintain a perspective, and to remember that it won't always be like this, and that this, in compared to other crises, has its own personality, and may, I don't want to say isn't as bad as we think it is, because for a lot of people, COVID in particular has been terrible, but for a lot of us, it hasn't been terrible. It's been a huge inconvenience. So trying to keep things in perspective.
So, what would be a couple of the things that you say to your students at the University of Maryland, or to the students with us tonight, in terms of how we go about covering crisis as journalists, in terms of some of the big issues that you just mentioned? What would some of the key pieces of advice you would offer them as they proceed into this unknown place?
Right. One is to always try to find sources that are outside of the spokesman for the government, to try to burrow into whatever bureaucracy you are assigned to cover, so that you can make sources that can fact check what you're being told. And that's difficult, but it's a trait that all good journalists learn, is to how to get behind the story. And the other one is to somehow, uh hate to say this, I know there are editors out there, but to be able to stand up in a professional way to editors who are maybe pushing you in one direction, which may be what everyone else is reporting. I think back on the reporting around the Iraq War. Nick Kristof did some great work on that, but it was a hard time in the newsroom to push back against the wall of sort of the common thought at the moment, that in that case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So, and the third is to listen to people that have different points of view. I think this one is key for where we are at the moment. Uh, to listen to the Trump voters, uh, to figure out why we are so divided, and I do think that in the end there are common many things that we share in common, that will get us to a point where the country won't be as divided if we can somehow figure out what our commonalities are, and to really start listening to each other.
So I know we're going to talk to Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn in a moment, but do you have, I know that we talked about some remarks that you might like to offer and reflections on your time. I know you've just given us a bunch of those reflections, but would you like to take a moment or two to do that before we bring Nick and Sheryl to the screen?
Well, I'd just like to say again that or not again, but I'd like to iterate how important I think it is that this conference is in Santa Fe and not in New York and not in Washington, and is not only speaking to the reporters in those two places. Uh, Santa Fe is an amazing uh, collection of former diplomats, but it's also, and what have you, but also uh, very much a Western frontier. And I think it's so refreshing to hear the questions and the opinions of people that are not on the East Coast. And that's really been one of my favorite things about it. But I have to say that the other is this international collection of journalists, and that's the one silver lining to this online conference, is that we have the potential, and I know that you've been working a lot on that, to make our reach even bigger. And that's so important, not just because, it's cool to talk to people on the other side of the world, but I think one of the trends in journalism that is so hopeful and very exciting, and I'm involved in for the first time actually in my career, are the international consortiums of reporters who are getting together to try to conquer some of the hardest stories to put together. The stories about the pilfering of countries' treasuries through money laundering and through kleptocracy, and the violent cartels that are not just trafficking drugs to the United States, they're trafficking them all over the world, and they're trafficking human beings everywhere. So those stories are global, and they need a global talent pool to help report them. And so, to the extent that maybe by the end of this conference, we can share business cards, we can share ideas, maybe even we can talk about stories that we might like to try to do together in chat rooms or whatever. I think that would even further the goal of an international conference like this.
I totally agree. I totally agree, and that's certainly the intention. And we've achieved a lot of that over the years. But as you say, I think we've got a lot of potential to keep growing and to keep this conversation alive and well and truly global in its scope here in Santa Fe. Who knew? It's wonderful. So let me ask Nick and Sheryl to come on the screen, and we will launch into a conversation with them. Aha! Hello,
Hello.
welcome.
Hi there.
Hey there.
Welcome, Deanna. Let me turn it over to you.
Okay, it's great to see you. So tell us where you are.
We're in Westchester, New York, actually in New York, basically.
Great. Well, I'm so happy to be with you because I think of you as Crisis Central, actually. I don't know. You guys have been in the eye of the storm so many times. Sudan, Darfur, China under Tiananmen or in Tiananmen. Nick, the Arab Spring. I mean, you were at one point literally in the middle of the square telling people what was going on. And then recently with your book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, I think it's really special that you're here because I think we are the crises. In addition to all other crises going around the world, who would have thought that, here in the wealthiest country in the world, that we would be the crises too? And so I'd like you to talk about that as well. But I thought I would start with one of your favorite covering crises moments. If you could both reach back among the many that you have covered and put yourself inside of it for a moment, tell us what it was like inside, and then what you might have learned as you were able to step back a little bit from it.
Why don't I start off because I'm going to reach back to China and the Tiananmen Square crackdown and the aftermath of that. So that really was a series of pro-democracy demonstrations that we weren't sure how it was going to evolve. But I remember the first inkling that I had that something was afoot was I was sitting on the campus of the Beijing University, and there was, a young student who looked like he was about 9 years old, literally, and a professor, a physics professor, astrophysics professor, and they were just talking about. They called it a democracy salon, and they were just talking about things. And I thought, oh my God, these kids are they're so young and they're so naive, and they're they're thinking because they hadn't read John Locke, they hadn't read any of the philosophy that we're so used to seeing. And then it evolved, obviously, through the Tiananmen Square democracy protest, and then the crackdown on Tiananmen Square, where the military basically just rolled in and started shooting. At first, they were shooting in the air, and then they started shooting on people. And we knew people who were on the square when it was shot at. And it was just devastating. We had never thought that that would happen. Then after, of course, the crackdown, there was just basically a muzzle on all of the press. At that time, China had been sort of opening up. The press had been opening up, but then there was just this huge muzzle. And so we were there during the aftermath of those years. And one thing that it's interesting. So there were many lessons from that, but one lesson that I can draw upon that has relevance now is that in China, because there is this propaganda machine, the government, controls all of the press. Chinese people, they've born and raised in that environment. So you think, well, they don't know any other. Do they believe the Chinese press? And we met lots of people who didn't have high school education, people who maybe had a middle school education. They were always very skeptical. They would always read the press, and they would assume the opposite, the exact opposite, because I actually didn't believe that it was so bad. I thought they just stretched it, but they said absolute lies. And I think back to the US, and I think back to Americans who, some of whom are, they take things at face value. Depending upon what news organization you're watching, you sort of, if you've watched it over, time and time again, you tend to believe what is being said there, and you don't go out and, corroborate with other news organizations. We Americans, which just surprised me, they just, obviously there's a huge swath of people who are constantly checking other websites to make sure that something is true. But I was very surprised, and I think that we also, after this election, were surprised how many people actually just do take the source of news, and it really is becoming propaganda. I mean, we Americans are suffering in some ways a degree of what the Chinese face in a propaganda world, but we don't think of it as propaganda.
Oh, okay.
And Dana, I think I would say I would turn to Congo, maybe the most lethal war since World War II. And people always ask me how it is I managed to cover genocide and humanitarian crises and still feel pretty good about the world, sort of prevent myself from being incredibly depressed. And the truth is, and you know this, Dana, and journalists who've covered crises know this, that side by side with the worst of humanity, you always find the best. And maybe it's a flaw in the way we, report the world. But in that case, I covered a warlord who was murdering and raping people, and kids who were dying of hunger. And it left a deep impression on me about the human capacity for evil. But what also struck me was how far ordinary Congolese and others were going to try to stand up to that evil. Evil is this kind of Old Testament word we don't normally use, but you go to these places that are being attacked by a warlord, what you see is truly evil. And there was a Polish nun who particularly struck me in one little town called Rutsuru, and every other aid worker had fled, and she was working. She'd been there 31 years. She was working with the local townspeople to have an emergency feeding center, to run an orphanage, to negotiate to keep the warlord out of town. And she underscored to me, and so many other Congolese who were there, just the human capacity when we're tested for strength and resilience and toughness and and just magnanimity. And I came back from Congo and wanted to grow up and become a Polish nun. I was really deeply impressed by the human capacity when we're not tested in the US most of the time, but when humans are tested, we're capable of amazing goodness.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna. That leads into my next question, which I hope isn't too personal, but I would like to, for people who haven't been reporters, you know, it might be a little bit hard to understand, why you would keep going back to places that are very uncomfortable and how you deal with it personally. Um, so how do you, how do you see people who are in such bad shape uh, and keep going back, or how do you face that evil, face the violence and the aftermath of violence, and deal with it personally?
Well, I mean, I'd say that the reason I go back, it's mission driven. I made one trip to Darfur and I never thought I'd make another trip. And then I saw kids who were the age of my children, and it's an arid area, so families were hiding out, but they had to go to wells every now and then. And the Janjaweed militia was staying by the wells. And when a man would show up from the wrong tribe to get water, they would shoot him. And when a woman showed up, they would rape her. And so these poor families were sending their young children, 7, 8-year-old
Mm.
kids with donkeys miles across the desert, because sometimes the Janjaweed would leave those children alone. And watching these families in terror sending their kids with these donkeys across the desert to an uncertain fate
Mm.
at those wells, I came back and I just could not get that out of the mind. And their kids were the age of my kids, and I couldn't imagine doing that. And so it haunted me, and I made another trip and another trip and another trip. And um, in terms of how one deals with it, I do think that it really does help that you see heroism
Mm.
alongside the evil, and you see inspiration and goodness. Um, and you also have, and I'm not proud of it, but you sort of develop a numbness,
Mhm.
and a suit of armor that protects you. And so you are just trying to professionally to get the best anecdote you can as fast as you can before you put yourself and your driver and your interpreter at risk, and then get out of town. And um, I mean, I remember these horrible times in Darfur where I'd go to a village, I'd be scared, and I would be trying to get the best, most compelling anecdote I could get. And so I'd ask the village chief, so who here has been shot or injured? And they would take me to some, elder who'd been shot in the arm. And because an elder was important, and I would immediately know that I can do better. And I'd say, excuse me, is there a child here who's been shot?
Yeah.
And I would feel terrible saying that. But that, I think in journalism, we do develop that that armor, and it's kind of a necessity at times.
Mhm. In
Mhm.
Tightrope, we actually brought that kind of, approach to the US. And what was really hard about Tightrope is that we were, talking to people around us in Yamhill who Nick had grown up with, and also people who, I had seen for decades. And so here we were, talking about, learning about their pain and their suffering. And this is the kind of pain and suffering that, you know, also exists around the world. This is not lessened any less severe than what we've seen reporting overseas in
Mm.
the most poverty-stricken areas. I mean, it is just devastating. We also did see, as Nick said, we saw heroism. We saw, programs run by local people who have said this is a problem we cannot just let lie. So they've devised a drug treatment program, or they've devised another things, and it's really important to have that. There was this one story where we knew of someone whose basically whose niece, he was not quite a niece, but he was going out with someone whose family had a terrible situation. The daughter was basically the father was the grandfather, the same
Oh.
person. So clearly she was the victim of
Mhm.
incest and rape.
Mhm. Mm.
And so her family, she actually grew up not really going to school. She was homeschooled, so to speak. But when she tried to go back mainstream in ninth grade, she couldn't last for more than a month because she just was at sea. So
Hmm.
now she has about 5 kids with 4 different partners, and she had 2 kids, the oldest and the youngest, who were like in kindergarten and pre-kindergarten. They went to school and they got suspended because one of them was trying to steal an iPad. And so she was so embarrassed. And so she actually now is homeschooling them.
Oh boy.
Listen, she is homeschooling. She doesn't have any degree herself, and she also has to provide for them. And sadly enough, her boyfriend is maybe a pedophile. So here we were trying to get this story. Wanted to talk to her. She refused to talk to us. But in a way, we did write about this in Tightrope. But in a way, I was almost relieved because I don't know that I could have faced
Hmm.
trauma that her kids are going to face because they're cooked. And I didn't know what the solution was going to be.
Hmm.
She wasn't going to seek any help. I wasn't sure how she was going to be helped. It's a terribly sad story, but there are many of those in the US.
And can you just give a little bit of background? This is near where you grew up, Nick, correct?
That's right. It essentially, Tightrope is a look at the crisis in working class America, and we were covering humanitarian crises around the world, and we'd go back to my hometown of Yamhill, Oregon, and we saw a humanitarian crisis
Oh,
unfolding there. And a quarter of the kids on my old school bus are now dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
mm,
Um, Two of the, having covered sexual violence around the world, two of the boys on my old bus who I grew up with were sent to prison for raping young girls. And trying to understand how that happened, and in a community where we were proud of the social fabric, proud of our values, and what went wrong, and realizing that this was a crisis not in one bus route or in one farm town, but in much of the country where jobs left, where the social fabric collapsed, where people then reached out, in my view, to a demagogue who was offering solutions,
mhm.
and trying to understand all that, through the prism of the kids on my old school bus who are my dearest friends, and who Sheryl has known now for many, many years as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so timely, obviously, that because that's what we're dealing with in the country. What did you learn about trying to report in a way that people will read it? It's not far away, and people aren't chopping heads off. Thank God.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's real. It's a crisis. It's why we're in a bigger crisis. So, as reporters, what were you looking for, and how did you conceive of bringing these stories alive for an American audience?
Well, for one, we were actually more surprised at how devastating the pain and suffering was in these households. I mean, we never imagined. I mean, these are people like, for instance, Clayton Green is someone we write about in Tightrope, and he's someone who worked on the family farm for years. We'd see him almost like every day when we were in Yamhill, and we have chit chat. We talk about something that had to be done on the farm. He was very talented in fixing tractors. I mean, you just put a broken tractor in front of him and he just snap, and somehow or other he fixes it. We have no idea how. He has a speech impediment, so it's very hard to understand him. So we never got into like real, lengthy discussions. But as we were writing Tightrope, we started probing and learning more about his family, and it was just shocking the
Hmm.
what kind of horrible downward spiral his entire family household was falling into. So
Hmm.
his son, for instance, started out okay with a nice, $20 an hour job in some cases, but then when the financial crisis hit, he lost his job. He moved to Idaho, and then he got divorced from his. They had huge fights between him and his wife. He had 3 kids there. Drugs were involved. The kids got taken away from him. And then a couple of other kids he had with someone else. All 5 kids have been taken away by the state because, he, is he's just not a reliable parent. And it's just so sad that the multiple problems that they have. Like, so for instance, he doesn't have a driver's license because he violated. I think he was either drunken driving or a couple of other things, and so he's never tried to get his driver's license back. But the result is that how does he find a job in Oregon when you need to drive? It those are kind of things that really shouldn't happen, but it takes a huge amount of effort to climb out of that. And so these stories just sort of rolled out of these people's mouths. I mean, it really wasn't hard for us to find, so to speak, anecdotes. I mean, there were just so many stories like that. And it wasn't just in Yamhill. I mean, we went to Baltimore, we went to Oklahoma, we went to Arkansas, and we just story after story. There's a lot of pain going on in this country. And we were worried that people wouldn't want to talk to us about it. But we found that, they were glad that people were listening to them.
And so what did you come away with? Did you have any reflections on the media at large, that for one, you were surprised at what you found and you hadn't been alerted to it, by dozens of other reports like that? Do you have any reflections on how we're doing and not doing?
I wonder what your take is on this, Anna, but my sense is that we in the media are very good at covering what happened today. We're not good at covering what happens every day. And so, public health crises are what we, I think, just perennially fumble. Yeah. And, I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were important stories. I'm glad I covered them. But every 2 weeks in America, we now lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, these deaths of despair, than died in 19 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't think that we in the media adequately covered that crisis here at home, those deaths of despair, or indeed sufficiently clued in readers or audiences into the political consequences of that disaffection, one of which, we have lived through for the last 4 years. It's more complicated than that. That's too simplistic, but there is an element of that. And, and in general, I think we in the media, we have to figure out how to do a better job, both abroad and at home, of covering these broad sweeping changes that happen more gradually, that happen every day and not just on one particular day.
Yeah. And how did you learn anything about the distrust or the trust of media from what you were doing? Because that again is one of the crises that literally did not exist 4 years ago. It's just sort of overnight we all of a sudden are divided on what is the truth.
Covering the U.S. these days is a little bit like covering China at the time of Tiananmen, in that you have these completely distinct narratives, and you have a government that sometimes says things that are, palpably untrue. We were, it was Tiananmen Square, and the government said this was putting down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. Well, no, it wasn't. But you had to both quote what the government said, but you also had to signal that this was not true. And, that I think is something that resonates with a lot of reporters in the US these days.
So how do we begin to break through?
I mean, one of the things that has troubled me about the crisis, here in the US is just how people live in their own news ecosystems. And so, actually, my friends in Oregon, if you, on their Facebook feed, they mostly voted for President Trump. They see Antifa threatening to overthrow the cities, to attack their communities. Democrats now trying to steal the election. And every bit of evidence that comes into their news ecosystem tends to support those theories. And, these are good people I've known for many years. I was talking to one of my old friends the other day, and he said that the problem with liberals is that they don't have good information. And I just, I was laughing. I was saying, Dave, that's exactly what we say about you. And there's this, I mean, I was going to say symmetry, but I don't think that's right, because I do think that, I do in fact think that my vision of the world is more accurate than his, but trying to figure out how one approaches people who have a very different view of the world in ways that I think are dangerous, and can lead to to violence,
Yeah.
and yet do that in a way that respects them and is actually going to lead them to change their minds, rather than to just get defensive and resist even more. It's really hard.
I mean, that's
Well,
why I
so-
used the term propaganda before, because we were used to it in China, and it's a word that we would never use in the US, but I see so many similarities. And
Yeah.
so another friend of ours who lives down the road, so he's a very reliable neighbor. He's done so many favors for us, and we really like him. He's a decent person. But he obviously is a Trump supporter as well. And one time we were talking to him, we actually talked to him for the book. And, he says, you know what, I do worry about the divisiveness and the political divide in this country. He watches Fox News. He's, very open about that.
You
And
may have
he
switched
said,
to OAN now, but
so then he said to us that, but I like to watch the other side's news channels just to make sure to see what they're saying. And then he says, but lately I've been watching, and I can't take it anymore, because when I watch CNN, it's all lies. And I'm thinking, my goodness, it's all lies. What is he? We're just living in two different worlds.
Yeah.
And so that's a real
Well,
problem.
some people, and I'm not quite sure this is true. I've said this too, but now I don't know if it's the reason. But some people point to the demise of local journalism as the area where communities broke the link with trust with the media. Did you do you have any experience in that doing this book? Like, were there local reporters that they could trust, or maybe there were no longer any local reporters or local reporting? And then what about their experiences with you? You're both reporters, and they must have trusted you enough to let you in their world.
so I think the crisis in local journalism is a catastrophe for the country, and that civic life in these communities is the local newspaper. Traditionally, that was, that provided accountability, that knit the community together, and I think it's a catastrophe what is unfolding in the country. And I think we need a new model, because we don't have a business model that is going to support local papers. And I've come around to the view that we do need some kind of government support modeled on the NEH or NSF grants. But I don't think that the loss of those papers explains the loss of trust for the media writ large. I think that that's more of a phenomenon of kind of self-selection and internet. And the media thinker Nicholas Negroponte wrote many years ago that the internet was going to create a news product that he called the Daily Me. And now we all get the Daily Me, and I think that simultaneously delegitimizes everybody else and confirms us all in our prejudices. And I think it becomes important for all of us to try to escape the Daily Me and occasionally, look at the daily other.
I mean, they read the chapter that they're in, and we were nervous, but actually they thought it was fine. I mean, in fact, they liked it. So, but I think they think of us as different because we're their friends and we know them.
Yeah.
Versus we're not, being media writ large.
Right.
And there is kind of in their mind this bigger sort of looming thing that media writ large is anti them. And
Okay, so I have to ask you, even when you look at some of the media that says they're the mainstream media, I'm not going to name any names, but do you see things that you say looks like it's supposed to be news, but really there's way more opinion and innuendo than you've seen before?
So, I think that has certainly happened. That's happened partly because the business model is such that you know, people often want opinions, and they often want opinions that will confirm their own. And so there is a you know, as everybody's desperate for audience, that's one way to juice up your audience. And I think that it's also true that in for newspapers in particular, there used to be kind of a geographic division between what was news and what was opinion. And now, when you get things on Twitter or on
Yeah.
Facebook, you don't know if something was a news article or an opinion article, and so it all just blurs as you know, news articles. So I think that that has made it harder to distinguish. But
Which is something we could fix, right? We could label things opinion and analysis.
we do, but I don't.
Yeah.
I think it's hard. I know I do think it's harder to. I mean, at the times we keep putting bigger and bigger opinion signs next to opinion pieces, and you know, it's hard.
Yeah.
And you know, the other side of that is one that there's been a big debate about at the Times, and I think probably at the Post too, and at many places. And it's, you know, how we respond to a president who acts as President Trump does. And so, do we use the word lie, for example? And one of the things that I think we object to President Trump about is that he breaks norms. But on the other hand, one of our norms is that we don't use words like lie that are value laden. And how you respond to a norm breaking president in a way that provides accountability but
Yeah.
doesn't break other norms is hard. And in the end, I thought that news organizations were right to use the word lie. And you know, the parallels I would use were Joe McCarthy or the civil rights movement or Vietnam, sort of extreme cases where when news organizations just tried to quote both sides, the audiences really didn't understand where the truth lay. And in that situation, I think it becomes incumbent on us to, if you will, break that norm and to say, you know, it's not just quoting one side and then the other, but here's the way we understand where the truth lies, and this person is lying. But it's a hard, difficult thing that.
Well, have you noticed that in the election disputing that the president and his supporters are doing, really, it's almost like they found the media has found a way to say unsubstantiated. That's in almost every sentence now. So it's not lie, but it's without examples or without basis or unsubstantiated.
Yeah.
So it seems
I
like
think we're getting a lot better at it
Yeah.
after 4 years.
See, I think the issue is much bigger than that, than just choosing the word lie or not. I think it's in the choice of stories. So, for instance, when there were some pollsters, who were, you know, much more favorable to Trump, they were dismissed as, oh, those are Republican pollsters. And, you know, for instance, Trafalgar, everybody was dissing that poll as not accurate, but he was spot on. And, you know, we didn't investigate more. People did profiles of him, you know, a couple of days before, but they should have been on that like a month before to find out what is it that we are getting these Republican polls versus the mainstream polls, which were all wrong too. So I think that in fact the Trafalgar and the Republican polls were actually more accurate than the mainstream polls. But we weren't questioning, you know, why is it that there's this big gap? Because I do think the mainstream press is more, you know, pro-left. I also think in the choice of stories. So, for instance, how many people, you know, did stories about Yam Hill or, you know, or other red state, you know, real people, not just fly in and then write the story and then there's the token story, but constantly going back and talking to these people and you know, in all of the different places and in the battleground states. I mean, they should have, you know, plunk themselves down in each of the battleground states to find out, you know, the red counties, you know, what is it that people are thinking? We just missed. I mean, I don't know, the mainstream press just sort of missed it. And I do think it's bigger than just like whether we choose, you know, to call them on lies. I think it's like story choice. It's just, you know, I'm glad that there was a lot of coverage of Trump's financial and economic background because we didn't do enough of it or it wasn't done enough in 2016. But I do think that more could be done, you know, even so. I mean, you know, when there were ties, when there were corrupt, it's good that they covered the Biden ties to Ukraine, but there were also a lot more similar stories on the Trump side that weren't covered either. So,
So I have to just follow up once more, even though we're getting a little bit off the subject of crisis, which is, do you think the media holds itself accountable enough? You remember how we kind of missed the 2016 election? And now we sort of missed the polls in some way.
I mean, yeah, I do. I actually think the media are pretty good at looking in the mirror, and part of that is because we're also self-important that we
Right.
that we think we're the be all and end all, and so I think we do make some real effort to hold ourselves accountable. I'm not sure though that we fully learn lessons or at least apply them, and part of that I think is just the business pressure of getting an audience, and there is a tremendous appetite for horse race stories. So we always complain about how horse race stories are terrible, and then we always do more of them because
Yeah.
they pay the bills. And uh,
Yeah.
and looking back at COVID, um, I think we in journalism have to acknowledge the fact that we could have done a much, much better job warning about the risks of pandemics. This was something that public health people have been talking about for years, that
Yeah.
Bill Gates have been jumping up and down about, that we knew about, but I don't think we shared what we knew with the public in a way we should have.
Yeah. So can I ask you for your big thoughts about covering crisis? If you look at your own participation and then stepping back and what you learn each time, we are in the middle of these crises, multiple right now in the country that we've just been talking about. Do you have a kind of reflection on where we are, trying to get yourself out of in the middle of where we are and see it from some perspective? Do you have some reflections on that?
Um, so, I mean, I think that the U.S. crises, whether it's COVID or these other, that we will cover those, and we will probably do a pretty good job covering them. I'm more worried about some of the international crises, and that's partly because the U.S. is looking inward, Europe is looking inward, and the truth is that COVID is causing a global catastrophe that we've all tuned out of. And globally, it's not so much that people who are being infected with the virus and dying of the virus. It's kids starving to death because local economies are impeded. It's
Yeah.
the fight against polio is being set back because polio eradication has stalled. It's an extra 13 million child marriages because efforts to interrupt child marriages are stopped. An extra 2 million girls getting female genital mutilation because efforts against that are stopped. And there, one of the great things about the last 40 years has been these enormous strides against global poverty, against child death, and um, that has stopped this year. And it's
Mm.
we in the media really have not covered that crisis,
Yeah.
and it's really hard to now because especially if you're a television executive producer, there is just nothing in it for you to go and send a camera crew off, even if it weren't for COVID, to try to cover these issues because your audience will will switch the channel. Anderson Cooper did a great
Mm.
job covering the 2005 Congo elections, and they had a big team that went to Eastern Congo. They did great work. They had satellite feeds, and that week Anderson's ratings fell compared to his rivals. And they aren't
Yeah.
going to go anywhere near. They're not going to mention Congo ever again, and that's not his fault, and it's not his executive producer's fault, but it is a basic structural problem in how we manage to cover some of these important global crises.
Mm.
I think that's true. I also think that we do need to cover more of the rest of America, because I think the mainstream media sort of, just sort of missed what half of America is thinking.
Mhm.
And they tend to stay in the cities of all of the states rather than go to red counties. I mean, I think there should be a line of reporting at every newspaper where look at the reddest state or the red counties in the state and just cover them as a
Yeah.
line of reporting so that we can learn more about America and why Americans don't want to wear masks, because we do need to uncover why Americans and why Western Europe is doing so badly at managing the crisis, whereas Africa's actually doing a good job of managing the pandemic itself. I mean, they have their own problems with the aftermath in the economies, but Asia, they're doing a great job just managing the pandemic, but we aren't. So why are Americans so bad at this? And I think that it's not just top down management, it's also bottom up. So let's, find out a little bit more about Americans in general, why we aren't implementing it so well.
Well, I think you just announced a great student journalism project. For all the journalism students in all the universities, just go to your red counties and just simply, like you say, get to the bottom of why people won't wear masks. Get to the bottom of it. It's not easy, but
No, it's not, yeah.
yeah,
And
but it
people don't open up to you the first second that you
right.
speak to them. It takes time.
I see Sandy.
Well,
Sandy's
let
got
me jump
questions.
in. Thank you both so much. We have a number of questions from the audience, and if you haven't yet typed in your question in the Q&A box out there, please do so. We seem to have a lot of questions about the election, about President Trump. Let me summarize them like this. We know well what President Trump has done in terms of fake news or calling the media the enemy of the people. Two questions out of that. What do you think the effect of that has been and may yet be on other countries? And how do we kind of come back from this moment of our political leadership calling into question and doubt the work of journalists?
I mean, there's no doubt that this had a effect on other countries and empowering authoritarians all over the world. And you saw the degree to which leaders abroad, like Hun Sen in Cambodia, began to use terms like fake news as they were arresting journalists or cracking down on organizations. And my old friend Jamal Khashoggi is dead, murdered, tortured, murdered, and dismembered. And I think that was because, to some degree, the U.S. government sent a signal that it, that it did not care about journalists who were criticizing governments and did not care about human rights and would not hold governments accountable. And journalists in other countries, I think you were having Maria Ressa later on. I mean, the courage that journalists like Maria show is just inspiring to me. And we in the US can learn so much from people like her in their willingness to take real risks to stand up to leaders. In terms of how we rebuild trust, I think that I think American institutions have actually held up better than a lot of people think they have. And it's not just journalism, it's law, it's the civil service, it's the independence of the military, that these have all been tested. And I think to some degree so far they have withstood that test. I'm hoping that temperatures will indeed lower, and that I was sort of a kid in the aftermath of the Nixon period, but that was also a time of immense polarization, of enormous stresses on institutions. And I went into journalism partly because I saw the way journalism had held a president accountable. And, it may be that there are some young people today, perhaps watching this, who, likewise think that there is something pretty cool about the way news organizations have tried to do their job when a president is calling them enemies of the people. I think it's a lot harder to rebuild at a time when we all can select our own news sources. It's harder, but the U.S. has gone through these cycles, and it's very hard to predict how they ebb and flow. But I would not give up hope.
I think one of the roles that the U.S. can augment is its ability, as places like yours, to train other journalists from other countries, to reach out and say, we'd like to train you, want to continue training you. We've got the best, journalism schools in the country. And I think that, just to, jump on that and to say, we're going to train even more people. I think that could really help, because I think they'll see that the tools and the principles and the concepts that are the foundation of these journalism schools are the best that they can be. I don't think they get any better in any other country. And so I think that that can really help augment the reputation of journalism per se in the U.S., because the schools have not been, denigrated. They've not been blemished in this. It's more the mainstream media. So the journalism schools stand out as still a really, thriving proposition.
So on the subject of students, we have a question here from one of our great high school fellows, Naima, who says, or who asks, how does reporting on a crisis, in your experience, affect or influence the people affected by the crisis?
So one of the things that strikes me is that you can't begin to address a crisis unless it's on the agenda, unless people are paying attention to it. And so if you're trying to address a famine or actually both at home and abroad, the issues that we as a society are worst at addressing are those that are hard to talk about for some reason, that are taboo. So it's anything related to sex or domestic violence or mental health or whatever, or anything that we're just not paying attention to. And so where news organizations, I think, are really important is not so much their capacity to change minds on issues, but rather the capacity to put issues on the agenda. And that is not a sufficient step to resolve the crisis, but it is necessary. And that's what that's earlier when I was talking about the importance of getting TV out to cover some of these global crises. That's kind of what I had in mind.
Let's go to China for a minute. Let's go around the world for a minute, but let's go to China first. And a question from former Foreign Service officer here in Santa Fe, Brian Goldbeck. He says, how, in your opinion, has the Chinese government's media control system evolved in terms of sophistication and responsiveness in recent years?
Well, it's gotten very sophisticated, more, towards the censorship, side of things. I remember a while back, before the internet really hit big in China, people were saying, oh, the internet is going to democratize China because you can't control the internet. Well, somehow the Chinese found a way to control the internet with all of their, all the fibers that come, the main fiber cables that come into the country. They're all, monitored and gate kept by the Chinese. And that's also, a symptom of how China's technology development has grown. People say, oh, they're just copycats, but boy, they are just geniuses in terms of getting to scale, in terms of improving on technologies and taking it to the next level. Because they've got so many people, they need to make sure that things work at scale. They're doing an excellent job of trying to monitor people, more so than we ever thought was imaginable. You think that 1984, it was using old technology. It's impossible for us to, be in a post-Orwellian world, because the tools are it's too dispersed. But they've I would not underestimate the Chinese. The problem is that it's the vision of President Xi Jinping, which is to really try and control the press, that is driving all of this. And so I don't see a reversal.
I would just add that one of the many dumb pieces that I've written over the years was about how the information revolution was going to change China, and Liu Xiaobo, the great Chinese dissident, said that the internet was the Chinese people's best friend, and we did see for a while how Chinese could get around internet control. So June 4th is the date of the massacre in 1989. So instead of saying so June 4th, that phrase would be censored. So people instead would say May 35th. And that would that would get by. And they use various other techniques. And I was experimenting with blogs in China and sort of seeing where the red lines were. And then gradually under Xi Jinping, they clamped down, and you can't say May 35th anymore. And and they also, they have cultivated nationalism in a way that I think, many ordinary Chinese now do ally themselves with the government in a lot of these conflicts, kind of intuitively. And so even if they do have access to foreign news, it doesn't really change any minds.
Well, actually, that's a really good point, because the whole idea of having a strong economy behind you, people will support you more. So, for instance, Xi Jinping, China's economy is now coming out of COVID pandemic, and they're actually experiencing real growth, much more so than other economies in the world, other large economies in the world. And so there's a lot of support he can marshal behind that. And I think that's true in the US too. When you've got a great economy going, that strength garners you more support. And so that's why I think also Trump garnered a lot of support, because people thought that he knows how to run an economy. They just have in their mind that he's more of an economic czar than Biden is, which, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, I do think that, a lot of it is just distortion and maybe, lack of a better way of presentation on the side of the Democrats. But, I do think the economic strength has a lot to do with people's ability to be, I don't want to say gullible, but more accepting of what is being said when economic growth is doing, gangbusters. There's no reason to question, the powers that be, because everything's going well, materially.
So in some of the dangerous places you've worked around the world, this is a question from Susan Haynes in the audience. Take us behind the scenes a little bit in terms of what security precautions are taken by the New York Times or by book publishers. I mean, what kind of apparatus surrounds you when you're reporting from or writing in, some of the world's difficult places?
So that has changed over the years. I'd say that, frankly, in general, news organizations have not been careful enough about, and reporters themselves have not been careful enough. I think Sheryl would definitely, she makes that point to me a lot. Photographers and video people are the ones in particular who take enormous risks. And we became targets over the period when I was a correspondent. That it used to be that journalists were, killed by accident periodically, but then it turned out that we have economic value, that we can be held and kidnapped and ransomed for large sums, and so that also changed the equation. And organizations didn't really need us because they could put out statements on the internet. And so so a lot of news organizations do have security advisors now. Sometimes there are security escorts, and I have found them not to be. I tend to think that they almost call more attention to what one is doing. I tend to believe in trying to go, kind of undercover in a local vehicle, not make plans ahead of time, so nobody. If you hire a bunch of people to escort you, then they're going to tell their cousins, and there's just a risk that somebody's cousin is then going to, do a deal and do a kidnapping. So I kind of believe in just doing things sort of spur of the moment, low key. And I'd also say that the big risk is, at the end of the day, not to us, but to our local interpreters and our local drivers. And in Darfur, I remember, one day we were in a village that was about to be attacked, and everybody who was able-bodied had fled. But I was interviewing those people who were waiting to be massacred because they couldn't leave; they were too weak or disabled, and it was very powerful. But my driver had the car waiting, pointed out, but finally my interpreter said, "Look, they're going to arrive any moment, and you have value. They will just hold on to you. Me, they're just going to shoot me immediately. And he was right. And I took him. I mean, so we drove away, and at that, and we didn't get as much reporting as I would have liked, but we do. I don't know that we always fully appreciate our responsibility to our local staff who take all of the risks and get none of the credit.
Last question, I promise. Thank you. Is from Randy Sword out in the audience. And it's a wonderful question, which is, what are the challenges you face as a couple in covering the news? I mean, there must be some amazing parts to it, and maybe some other more challenging parts to it.
Well, we have to go back because I'm no longer a journalist. We wrote Tightrope, and that's where the journalism comes in, I guess. I guess the one challenge that I would say, I guess the anecdote that illustrates the challenge is that when we were in Japan and an earthquake happened, here's another crisis. You know, I happened to get a premonition of it because my son, I was nursing my son, my little baby, and he got me up early, and I felt a tremor, and that turned out to be the Kobe earthquake, even though we felt it in Tokyo. So I rushed down to Kobe, and Nick was actually writing the main story from Tokyo. But the problem is, we had to have someone with the kids. So here I was reporting in Kobe for several days, and he was itching to get down there. So he called me up and said, the kids really miss you. They really want to see you.
Kind of fighting dirty. Put the kids on the phone and coach him to say, "Mom, we miss you."
So of course I was on the next, train back home.
But it's, I would say that, people sometimes ask us versions of that question with the subtext of how do you write together and stay married? But it's, well, if you can raise kids together and stay married, a book is a piece of cake. But also that, when we were reporting on some of these, like in China, we were tailed every time we left the house. We were just terrified we were going to get Chinese friends arrested and sent to prison for years. It was, Sheryl got knocked down to the ground by a bunch of Chinese thugs, sent by the government. It was, we just felt a lot of pressure, and we couldn't talk to anybody else about this. At one point, we had to decide. There was a young Chinese man who had helped the New York Times. He was in prison for that. He escaped from prison. He came to us and asked for help escaping China. What do we do? And we couldn't ask editors. That we had to make this. And it was so good to be able to have, for each of us, a partner who could, be strong in the face of all this pressure from the Chinese government, all these difficult ethical and moral decisions. And boy, I'm glad that, we were a couple
lucky.
there.
We were very lucky.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to share your insights with it. We've enjoyed it tremendously. Why don't you come to Santa Fe when travel resumes? We'd love to have you.
We look forward to that. We just got to cure this virus first.
Well, thank you so much. Most appreciated.
Take care.
Bye, Sandy. Thanks, Dana.
Bye. So now we are going to hear from Xavier Dominguez, who is a student down at New Mexico State University. He's a freshman studying journalism and mass communications down there. And in 2020, he was the Student Journalist of the Year from the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs. Xavier, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy, for having me. And hi, everyone, and welcome. So, in the words of American journalist and diplomat Henry Grunwald, journalism can never be silent. That is its greatest virtue and its greatest fault. It must speak and speak immediately. While the echoes of wonder, the claims of triumph, and the signs of horror are still in the air, this is why journalism is needed now more than ever before, to tell the stories that the world must hear during these unprecedented times. So my start in journalism was not really something I anticipated for during my freshman year of high school. But through taking classes and landing a fellowship with PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs, I got to speak from people my age from across the country who were struggling to have a voice of their own. And with the fellowship, I was able to share their story and give them a platform to be heard. It was not until then when me and my peers who worked on the story got a thank you letter for sharing their voice. And I realized I can make a difference in the world, whether that's big or small. While being in a crisis for the past 8 months, there have been many obstacles journalists have to overcome, myself included. But through these months, I've learned how to surpass the challenges, such as not being able to film or interview in person. And trust me, I like to be very social. However, amongst the struggle, it has led me to report on recent graduates not being able to find jobs and to also share youth perspectives on certain issues with my internship at KRWG Public Media. Covering crisis is so vital to many people who may not know what's going on in our nation's capital, issues in other countries, and from our neighbors right next door. However, the brave journalists who go out each and every day to risk their lives to tell the stories that matter and to the stories that the public needs to know are examples of what Grunwald suggests, and that is to speak and speak immediately with any story, and he urges us all to report the underreported stories, even those during a crisis.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you. That was wonderful. And just to know, folks, we're going to feature 4 or 5 different student voices throughout the conference in our main session. So, Xavier, thank you, and we look forward to all the things that you are working on. And good luck, best of luck to you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. So let's now turn to the mayor of Santa Fe, Alan Weber, who has a few remarks for us.
Hey everybody, Alan Weber here from the mayor's office. A few words about the Journalism Under Fire convening this year. This is increasingly becoming an important, significant, and vital part of the Santa Fe community and our gift to the country and the world. It's a chance to reflect on what's going on here and around the world in journalism, the incredibly important role and the increasingly challenging role that our journalists play to maintain freedom of the press, freedom of the media, freedom of journalism, freedom of reporting, and a commitment to finding and reporting the truth. This is a moment in the country and around the world where journalism is not only under fire, it is under attack. There are people all over the world who are stepping into new media, social media, even old media, and using it to perpetrate lies, spread misinformation, disinformation, and reorganize the facts into an alternative reality. It's even more critical because of all that we're dealing with in terms of critical issues, whether it's the coronavirus, the economic impact of the coronavirus, the issue of social justice and racial justice, divisions in communities around cultural identity, anger at all the change that's going on here and around the world that makes people doubt our ability to stick together, work together, and share a common view. Journalism does that. Journalism provides the platform on which we all stand. But it can't do that if it is discredited, if it is attacked, and if the journalists who practice good journalism are demoralized and demonized and called the enemy of the people. Now more than ever, as we have these multiple crises, we need to stand with journalists. We need to respect their work and support them as individuals and as professionals. We need to stand for the truth. We need to stand for facts. We need to stand for honesty. We need to stand for the recognition, as odd as it sounds, that there aren't multiple versions of reality. We are not dealing with a film version of America. We are dealing with reality here and now. The facts matter. The truth matters. Honest reporting matters. People who go out and see and bring back the stories need to be given the respect and the honor and the support that they deserve. With that in mind, I want to read this proclamation from the office of the mayor, an official proclamation of the city of Santa Fe. Whereas from November 10 through December 3, 2020, journalists from around the world will participate in a digital conference on covering crisis. And whereas the truth is under fire from oppressive regimes around the world and is actively discredited, twisted, and disbelieved, and whereas journalists around the world are under increasing fire, imprisoned, murdered, persecuted, disbelieved, harassed, and marginalized. And whereas journalism itself is undergoing a period of massive transition and change with new technologies and the spread of misinformation and the blurring of fact and opinion. And whereas the city of Santa Fe believes in open dialogue on core challenges to our society, in a free press, in the tremendous value of the free press, and whereas the city of Santa Fe would like to congratulate the Santa Fe Council on International Relations and all organizing partners for convening journalists from around the world for vibrant and dynamic discussion on these essential topics. Now, therefore, I, Alan M. Weber, Mayor of the City of Santa Fe, New Mexico, do hereby proclaim Tuesday, November 10, 2020, as Press Freedom Day. And I am happy to sign this and send my best wishes to everyone participating in this crucial convening. Please keep up the good work, keep reporting the truth, keep standing up for reality, and keep America's press free and independent. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. He's offered some amazing speeches for us at past Journalism Under Fire. The very first one in 2018 was, of course, about 6 weeks after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. And I remember well when our mayor took the stage and asked everybody to join him in a moment of silence for slain journalists around the world. It was extremely powerful. On that very subject, let me tell you, we have 3 amazing live streams coming to you tomorrow. The first one touches on subjects that Nick and Sheryl discussed and that the mayor just touched on, which is journalists who have been abducted for doing their work around the world. We'll hear from David Rode in particular. You may recall he was in the news recently because he was abducted in Afghanistan in 2007-8, and his abductors have now been found and are being prosecuted. We'll hear from Clarissa Ward on that panel as well, and we'll also hear from the family of Austin Tice. And he, of course, was a freelance journalist who was abducted in Syria in 2012, and nothing has been heard from since. At 1 o'clock, we're going to hear from Malachi Brown. Malachi's returning to the JUF stage from last year. He is, of course, a senior producer at the Visual Investigations Unit at the New York Times. His presentation last year was easily one of my very favorites that we've had for both of our preceding years. And then tomorrow night, we have another special one. We have E.J. Dionne, who's, of course, a syndicated columnist and opinion writer for the Washington Post. And he's going to walk us all through behind the scenes of what's happened with our recent election. So let us turn now to our famous singer here in New Mexico, Eliza Gilkyson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eliza Gilkeson, a folk singer from Taos, New Mexico, just about an hour and a half north of Santa Fe. I'm thrilled to be part of the Journalism Under Fire virtual gathering this week, but I'm very sorry we can't meet in person in this gorgeous part of the world so we can share our beautiful blue skies, our fall mountain air, the architecture, the food, and the culture of my favorite place to be in all the world, New Mexico. But speaking of journalism under fire, I have a song to play for you today that uses fire as the central imagery, because our world is on fire, literally. Truth-telling is under fire. And most importantly, we the people, we're fired up to do something about this. I've been crying in the dark of night. I can't find my way to sleep. Thoughts and prayers will never make things right. I have promises to keep. I've been hoping there'll be some way through. All our loved ones will be fine. No one knows what it'll come down to. So I'm just looking for a sign. On fire, on fire, on fire now. On fire, on fire, on fire now. I've been calling on my angel choir to put some wings upon my feet. Fill me up with inspiration's fire and get me out into the street. On fire, on fire, we're on fire now. On fire, on fire, on fire now. I've been following the brightest star, letting my conscience be my guide. There's no road map gonna tell us where we are. The fire of love burns deep inside. I've been crying in the dark of night, with miles to go before I sleep. Thoughts and prayers will never make things right. I have promises to keep. I have promises to keep.
Ah, that was wonderful. I love her work. She has some fantastic songs. Check them all out if you haven't yet. Eliza Gilkeson. So one last piece of thanks, which of course is to Dana Priest tonight. Thank you, Dana. Join us for lots of sessions this week with Dana. She'll be moderating EJ Dion tomorrow. Hi Dana. She'll be moderating Jacqueline and Matt Worker on Thursday night. And then she and I will be in a special conference interactive session on Friday. Bring your questions, bring your reflections, bring your thoughts, and Dana and I, especially Dana, will field them and provide some great insight. And I suppose on that note, we're all done. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Nick and Sheryl. And of course, be sure to join us for all the fun stuff we have coming up next. So until then, we'll see you all later and have a great night.